Okay, so in our last class, we went over how to write equivalent fractions. That is going to be very beneficial for today's lesson on comparing and ordering fractions. So we're going to start off by using an example and a list of steps you can follow in order to do this. So we are trying to compare 2/3 to 3/5 and order them from least to greater, so say which one's greater. So right now I have 2/3 and 3/5, and I look at them and I say, well, I know 2/3 is more than half and 3/5 is more than half, but I'm not exactly sure which one's bigger. In order to figure out which one's bigger, I'm going to have to write equivalent fractions that have the same parts. So I'm going to find a least common denominator. Remember, our denominator is our bottom number, so 3 would be the denominator of 2/3 and 5 would be the denominator of 3/5. So I need to find a common denominator. So what is the smallest multiple or the least common multiple of 3 and 5? So in order to do that, I'm going to say, well, I know that 15 works. So how do I get to 15? I can multiply the top and the bottom by 5. And if you recall, I have to multiply by 5 over 5 because that is the same as 1. So I'm not changing this fraction into something new. I'm just writing it in a different form. So I would have 10 over 15. So 10/15 is equivalent to 2/3. Now over here, I say, how do I get 15 as my denominator? Well, I can multiply the denominator by 3, which means I also have to multiply my numerator by 3. 3 times 3 equals 9, and 5 times 3 equals 15. So now my two fractions that I have are 10/15 and 9/15. So now these are broken into the same parts. Each whole is broken into 15 parts. And now I'm going to compare the numerator. This says if my whole was broken into 15 parts, I have 10 pieces. And this one says if my whole is broken into 15 parts, I have 9 pieces. So I know that 10/15 is greater than 9/15. So let's go and look at this problem using the same steps as before. I have 7/10 and 3/4, and I'm going to try to find the least common denominator. Now it doesn't have to be the least common denominator, but that's usually the easiest. So when I look at 7 and 10 and 3 and 4, 7/10 and 3/4, I know that I'm going to be finding a common multiple of 10 and 4. So my least common multiple of 10 and 4 is 20. So I would take 7/10 and I need to now figure out how do I get my denominator to equal 20. Well, 10 times 2 equals 20, and I have to do the same thing to the numerator, so I'm multiplying by 1. This will give me an equivalent fraction. 7 times 2 is 14, and 10 times 2 is 20. So I now know that 7/10 is equivalent to 14 over 20. And then I have 3/4. And I need my denominator to be 20. So I ask myself, what can I multiply my denominator by to get 20? And the answer is 5. So I also need to multiply my numerator by 5. So when I multiply across, 3 times 5 equals 15. And 4 times 5 equals 20. So now if I were to compare these two fractions, I had 7/10 and 3/5 to begin. And I know that 7/10 is equal to 14 over 20, and 3/4 is equal to 15 over 20. So they have the same parts, but this one has 14 pieces and this one has 15. So 3/4 would be bigger. Whoops, I made a mistake over here. Sorry about that. 3/4 would be bigger, and so your alligator faces that way. Okay, so let's go ahead and try ordering more than one fraction. So when you look at these, you'll see that there are 4 different denominators that I have to find something in common with. So I typically look to my largest denominator and say, well, what are my multiples of this? So I have 30. So now I'm going to look 15, 30. Can I multiply something by 10 to get to 30? Yes. Can I multiply something by 6 to get to 30? Yes. And can I multiply something by 5 to get to 30? And I can. So I know that my denominator for all of these is going to have to be 30. So if I start with 3/5 and I try to find the denominator of 30, I need to multiply by 6 over 6, which would give me 18 over 30. And then if I look at my next fraction, I have 5/6. And I ask myself, well, what can I multiply by 6 to get to 30? And the answer is 5. So I need to multiply both my numerator and my denominator by 5, which would give me 25 over 30. And then my next problem says 7/10. And I need to change my denominator to equal 30. So in order to write my equivalent fraction, I can multiply by 3 over 3, which gives me 21 over 30. And then last, I'm going to go up here and do it, 4/15. In order to get 15 to equal 30, I multiply by 2, which would give me 8 over 30. So now we have all of our fractions with the same denominator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place them in order from least to greatest, so smallest to largest. And I'm going to compare their numerators. So what's the smallest numerator I have now out of these new fractions I wrote? I have 18/30, 25 over 30, 21 over 30, and 8 over 30. So the smallest one that I see I have is 8 over 30. So this is going to be the first fraction. And then 18 over 30 is the second smallest. And then 21 over 30 is the third smallest. And then 25 over 30 is the fourth smallest. Now the part that I said in class is always the most tricky for students is putting the original fractions in number order. So when I look at my answers down here for my multiple choice, notice that they're in their original form. So 8 over 30 was the smallest fraction, which was equivalent to 4 over 15. So this was number 1. And then 18 over 30 was equivalent to 3/5, which was number 2. And then 7/10 was equivalent to 21 over 30, which was number 3. And then 5/6 was equivalent to 25 over 30, which is our fourth one. So B would be our answer for this problem. And we're going to go over one more way to compare fractions. So this is comparing fractions to 1/2, and it doesn't always work for every problem, but it is a good first check to use before finding a common denominator. So which is greater, 13 over 24 or 17 over 36? So what we can do here is we can compare the fraction to 1/2. So is 13 over 24 more than 1/2 or less than 1/2? And I know in order to be half of 24, I would need 12 over 24. So this is more than 1/2. And then 17 over 36. In order to be half of 36, I need 18. So we knew that this was more than 1/2. And half of 36 is 18. So this is less than 1/2. So without finding a common denominator, I know that since 13 over 24 is more than 1/2, I know it is a greater fraction. Okay? So in order to do that, you need to be able to figure out what half of your denominator is. So half of 24 was 12, and half of 36 was 18. So that allowed me to compare these two fractions. And that is it for today's lesson.